3 Bags Full, Chapter 3. Miss Maple gets wet. So we're just gonna... Willow's right there. She's got some snacks on the ground. She's being a little grumpy today. We ran out of some of her feet, so we have to go pick that up tomorrow. But she's got plenty of snacks and plenty of meals. It's just not her pellets. So I'm just gonna continue reading. Oh, okay. Make a mess. So, Chapter 3. George had not liked other human beings. It was rare for any of them to pass the meadow. Maybe a farmer now and then, or an old woman who wanted a good gossip. And when they did, George got cross. He used to put a very loud cassette in his gray tape recorder and escape into the vegetable garden, where he worked on something as dirty as possible until the visitors had gone away again. So the sheep had never seen a whole flock of humans before, and they were too surprised to panic. Later, Moppy claimed to have seen several people in the flock, but he was short-sighted. Zora counted 20, Miss Maple 45, and Sir Richfield lots and lots, more than he could count anyway. But Richfield had a terrible memory, particularly when he was worked up. He forgot what he had counted already, so he counted everything and everyone twice or 3 times. He counted the sheepdogs too. Mopple stared short-sightedly at the humans. Well, they could forget the theory of the murderer returning to the scene of his crime now. They had all come back to the scene of the crime, and the murderer must have been concealed among them. With curiosity, the sheep watched the human flock moving on. It was led by either the strongest nor the brightest among them, but by Tom O'Malley. Then came the children, then the women, and finally the men, who were hanging back a little with their hands awkwardly thrust into their trouser pants. While behind them again came several very old folk, who could move only slowly and shakily. Tom had brought a rusty old spade with him. He rammed it into the earth at least 10 paces from where George had been laying. The people retreated, as if Tom had splashed them with cold water, and formed a circle at a respectful distance. "It was here," shouted Tom, "right here. The blood spattered all the way here," he said, taking 2 long steps towards the dolmen. "And right here," he added, and 3 steps towards that direction. Is this where I was standing myself? This is where I was standing myself. The moment I see it, I knew it was all up with old George, blood everywhere, and his face all distorted. Horrible was, with his tongue bright blue and hanging out. What are you doing? None of this was true. Miss Maple thought how odd that was. It should really have been just as Tom said. Blood everywhere, a look of pain frozen on George's face. But George had been there on the meadow, looking as if he'd just laid down to sleep. The human flock retreated a little further and uttered a strange breathy sound, somewhere between horror and delight. Tom went on shouting. What your old friend Tom didn't panic. Not him. He was straight off to the old board to call the police. A voice interrupted him. You bet your life. An old friend, Tom. He'd always find his way to the pub. People laughed. Tom bent his head. The sheep up on their hill couldn't make out where he was saying any more. Whatever remarks of order had existed in the human flock now collapsed. Children were chasing all around the place. Grown-ups were forming little groups, beating the whole time. The wind blew scraps of words up to the hill. Goblin King, Goblin King, Goblin King. The children were singing. Could be he left it all to the church, said one red-faced farmer. Hey, Willow. She's scratching herself on the table, so the table's gonna be all shaky. Willow, my coffee. Willow. Get under from there. Come on. Willow. Come on. Come on. Oh my gosh. Most of my coffee's gone. You're interrupting story time. That Lily had a nervous breakdown when they found him. Twisted, a chunky, cheeky woman. The man standing next to her held her hand and smiled. A small man struggled. He was a sinner. What do you expect? Willow? Can you stop scratching yourself on the table, please? Come on, move. Get out. Get out. Stop. Stop. You're interrupting story time. He was a sinner. What'd y'all expect? And so are you a sinner too, Harry, screamed an old woman with gaps in her teeth. The lonely heart in, let's say, no more. Your auntie can hear herself, lucky to have such a good nephew. The man turned pale and indeed said no more. They say he was worth a fortune, said a man in the back. Old George had debts for sure, everyone knows that. A little too fond of his sheep was George, a young man was telling two friends. Know what I mean? He gestured, the other two laughed. A crime of passion among the sheep, eh? Cried the thinnest of them, so loud that a couple of women turned around. All young men laughed, their unpleasant laugh again. Must have taken by surprise, so it must, said a woman. Said a man who smelled strongly of sweat. And old George was damn hard to surprise. This is a disaster for the tourist trade, said a young man in a high-pitched voice. George really knew how to mess things up for us. He was going to sell everything to him, the sheep, the land, the whole lot, said a woman with no neck. Have you finally settled down? Oh boy. It was Satan himself who did this, whispered a woman of two small, fair-haired children. God have mercy on his soul, said another woman in a trembling voice. The sheep knew her. Bible-thumping Beth was George's name for her. Beth turned up regularly outside the shepherd's caravan to urge George to do something called good works. The sheep didn't know exactly what good works were, but they thought perhaps George was supposed to go and work in some other vegetable garden. But George had a garden of his own. The sheep could see why he didn't want to do as Beth said. Every time George said no, she passed a bundle of thin pamphlets called tracts into his hand, with a view of converting his sinful soul. There was no knowing what happened to George's soul, always surprising, always supposed he had one. But he was pleased to have those pamphlets, although he never read them out loud to the sheep. The evening after Beth brought them, George always had baked potatoes cooked over a small fire. Suddenly the enemy raced into the middle of the flock, the ancient enemy. All you could do was run away. Until recently there had been only a couple of enemies with the human flock, running around the meadow, sniffing, whispered off by their masters now and then, told to lie down, trying to make for the wide open spaces. But the closer the whispering groups of humans came to the dolmen, the further the dogs explored. They had now formed a small pack, 3 sheepdog and other dogs. The sheepdogs' eyes were shining. The pattern of their coats glinted across the meadow. They were making for the hill, making close to the ground. The sheep bleated in excitement. Now they'd been heard this way and that, chased apart and brought back together again, driven by sheepdogs moving like beasts of prey. No sheep could stand up to that. They weren't really frightened. They had been hurdled thousands of times before. But all the old discomfort had come over them. Then they saw the way the other dogs were moving, and their nervousness really did become fear. The gray wolfhound looked as if he was doing the same as the sheepdogs, crouching low before approaching. But something was wrong. He didn't bark, he didn't hesitate. For a moment the whole flock held its breath. They were being hunted for the first time in their lives. The dog began to run. Panic broke out. The flock dashed off in all directions, carrying the startled sheepdogs away with them. Mappo ran right through the crowd of human beings and knocked Harry the Sinner over. Zora took refuge on her rocky ledge. From there, she was the only sheep who could see what was really going on. The hill was empty. At its foot, close to George's place, lay two dark bodies, Otello and the dog. They were both just rising to their feet again. Otello attacked first. Zora had never seen a sheep go on the attack before. Otello should have run for it. The dog hesitated. It was a moment before he recognized the black figure of Otello racing up to him and his prey. Then he took off. But before they lost his nerve, but before they could, they lost their nerve, barked, and swerved away. Otello immediately changed directions, moved in a slight curve, and galloped back towards the dog. Again, Zora stared at the hill. It was clear to her that Otello was faster than the dog. The dog seemed to realize it too. He crouched on the ground, teeth barked, ready to leap at the ram from below. Zora quickly closed her eyes and thought about something else. That was her way of dealing with the bad moments in life. She thought of the day when she brought her first lamb into the world. She thought of the pain and the anxiety later because the lamb had been brown as earth, even though she had spent ages carefully licking the blood off its coat. Brown as earth, with a black face. Later the brown would turn a woolly white. But Zora wasn't to know that at the time. She had wondered why she was the only sheep in the meadow not to have had a white lamb. But then that lamb had belted, tiny and brown as it was, and he had been more beautiful voiced than any of the other lambs. He had smelled good too, and Zora knew she would defend him against the whole world, whether or not he was the brown color of earth. She had taken him to the cliffs that very day to show off the gulls and the sea. Zora relaxed. She had 3 lambs so far, and they were the bravest and most sure-footed sheep anyone could imagine. She hadn't brought a sheep into the world this year, and hardly any of the other lambs either. Zora realized why she had found meditating on the rocky ledge so hard recently, and why she was further than ever from becoming a cloud sheep. She'd missed the lambs all summer. Only 2 experienced young lambs had produced in an exciting, clumsy sort of way, and George had sworn them each of those lambs appeared. And then, of course, there was the winter lamb. Zora flailed scornfully. She listened. She would have liked a few more young creatures bleating just now, but everything was unnervingly quiet except for the cries of the gulls, and Zora did not take any noise of those anymore. The human beings were buzzing away in the distance like a lot of insects. Zora heard a terrifying scream, her eyes open, even though she was trying hard to keep them closed. Instinctively, she looked back at the hill. A dark blood body lay on the ground. Feet were twisting in the air as if it wanted to go on a run. She shuddered. The dog had gotten Otello. Only a moment later did she see that it was the wolfhound laying on the ground. There was no sign of Otello. The shaggy wolfhound was trying unsuccessfully to stand up. His master came along, one of the young men who had laughed in the nasty way. He was pale and poked his dog up with his foot. A farmer came to lift the animal and carry it away. The humans were buzzing excitedly. None of them could explain what had happened to that fine, strong dog. When they saw the blood on his belly, some of the women screamed. Satan and Goblin King ran through the air again. Human mothers bleated to their children came back to them. The human flock went away in a hurry, as suddenly as it had come. Only the spade was left. I think she's sleeping. Zora sat motionless on her rocky ledge, wondering if she might have been dreaming. Yes, that must be it. The grass around her was soft as a sheep's muzzle, and herbs that no one else could pull up grew here too. Zora called them herbs of the obese, and to her they tasted better than anything there was to eat in the meadow. The fresh sea air was cool. Seaweed smelt of cool seaweed guts, and the gulls circled around her. It was a good feeling that those white birds lowering below her. It was good to be alone. No one could follow her here. She saw the flock slowly calm down and begin to graze. Othello was with them. None of the sheep seemed to be taking any particular notice of him. Zora thought now how little she really knew about Othello. George had sometimes brought new sheep back with him. Usually they were newly birthed lambs, and were warmly accepted by the flock. As far back as Zora could remember, only 2 grown-up sheep had come from outside, Othello and Mopple the whale. Mopple had arrived 2 winters ago in George's noisy car. George transferred single sheep on the back seat. That's where they had first seen him. A plump young ram, staring in bewilderment out of the car window and eating George's road map. George had placed Mopple in front of them and made a little speech. Mopple was a ram from a meat breed, he said, and they weren't so to worry. No one here was going under the knife. The idea was just to bring in a little fresh blood. The sheep hadn't understood and were afraid of Mopple at first, but the young ram was friendly and seemed embarrassed. When Sir Richfield challenged him to a duel, it turned out that Mopple was no danger to anyone. Richfield had never challenged Othello to a duel, and none of the sheep had ever wondered why. More surprisingly was the fact that Othello had never challenged Richfield. Othello seemed to respect Richfield, although the harder of hearing and more forgetful he became, the less the other sheep could understand it. None of the sheep had seen Othello arrive. He just appeared one morning, a full-grown ram with 4 dangerously curved horns. 4 horns. They had never seen a 4-horned sheep before. The lambs were impressed, and they secretly were envious. Zora remembered all that very well. It wasn't too long ago. George didn't introduce Othello. Instead, he sang and whispered and danced. They'd never seen him so excited. He sang in strange languages and spread some of the ornaments they feared on the narrow. But impression wound running right over Othello's forehead. The sheep shuddered. While Othello stood perfectly still, George jumped from one leg to the other until he had to take his woolly sweater off. Zora trotted back to the other sheep. She wanted to ask if Othello had really just defeated a large gray dog. It seemed to her unlikely. She met Maudie, grazing near George's place, so close to it that Zora had to bite back a remark in passing. Maudie was chewing, lost in thought. "Maudie," said Zora, "did you see how Othello fought that dog?" Maudie stared blankly at her. "Othello is a sheep," she said. "Excellent grass around here," she added. Zora turned. She'd ask Maple, or better still Moppy, if any sheep could remember things. Then it was Mopple the whale. When she raised her head to pick up Mopple's scent, she noticed that Othello had joined the other sheep and was grazing by. He looked just the same as usual. George bent her head and began grazing. It was the best for sheep to forget confusing things as quickly as possible, before the world gave away beneath their hoofs. Okay, we're going to stop there. We have about 8 pages to go until the chapter's done.